Hi, welcome back. This is week 3, and you have in front of you the page that I created for week 3 with some references to Machiavelli, and this week's film will be Little Caesar from 1931. I don't know if you're familiar, you must have heard at least in the news or in other films with the RICO laws. RICO laws are racketeering charges that are brought up against members of criminal organizations that allow the federal government to give stronger convictions to even the accomplices to a crime that operate within that organization. Now, RICO is an acronym, but really the name RICO came from the nickname of the main character in the film Little Caesar. He is Enrico Cesare Bandello, and for his friends and his enemies, he is Rico. We'll see a different kind of criminal compared to Sonny, right? Sonny in A Bronx Tale is so slick. Of course, at some point he has to beat up the bikers, the bikers from this group called Satan's Messengers, but normally is very elegant in his manners as well as his attire. Rico too can be slick if you look at the way he dresses up through his career. In fact, he becomes more and more elegant as the film progresses, but he's a different kind of guy, is angrier, he has a short temper, he takes out the gun, the handgun, at the slightest inkling of a confrontation. So through Rico, we'll see the opposite of what Michael Corleone will be as a mafia character. Michael Corleone is somebody who has an emotional side and somebody who is a planner, a thinker. He thinks about crime, he thinks about family, he thinks about life in general. Rico, not much of a thinker, and in fact, there is this almost grotesque, stereotypical representation of the ethnic group of Italians, imagine the US in 1931, when they have this big banquet to honor Rico's achievements, and no one is able to deliver a decent speech. And by decent, I'm not saying eloquent, but something that would be minimally appropriate, because of course these Italians don't have the minds for these things, they're not educated, they don't have these kinds of skills. In the regular workforce, they're laborers. In the crime organizations, they are the hands that perform, execute the robberies, the murders. We'll see in this film also a moralistic view of crime, whereby the protagonist will die a broken man, crying, and his friend, his best friend Joe, instead, to show people that there is a way out, will manage to have a career in regular society as nothing less than a dancer, a professional dancer. Okay. If there is time, we'll watch a short silent film about organized crime in the early 1900s. We'll see. But today, we talk about Machiavelli. Let me just remind you a couple of things, since I had an announcement last week about a panel on Italian-American studies scheduled tomorrow. It was cancelled because at the end of last week, snow was in the forecast for today and tomorrow, and we had a guest coming from Chicago flying in. We have another 2 guests coming from the city, so it's another from Southampton. It seemed impossible to do this successfully. If you go to the announcement, I've marked that event as cancelled. Today, however, if you don't have another class, right after this, I'm going back to the Center for Italian Studies, 4th floor of the library. We have our biannual coffee mixer open to students and faculty. So you can have espresso, we have Uncle Giuseppe's fresh cookies, we have imported Italian cookies, Italian sodas, and you can see what the center is about, the scholarships it offers, etc. So if you want, if you have time, you can come later. We'll be there until 4. We'll be going on with this event until 4, or you can even walk with me if you want to. So let's talk about Machiavelli. We'll talk about his life. We'll talk about the history of his times. Keep in mind, not a history class. You're not going to be tested on dates, on places, on battles, etc. Just have an open mind, be curious, ask questions. Our goal, looking at Machiavelli's life and his mindset, is to be able to frame his ideology within his life experiences and the things that were going on around him, so that we can better understand his ideas, his recommendations, the very core of the Prince. And I want to talk about chapter 7 of the Prince, because I didn't have a chance to do it last week, and Cesare Borgia, the ideal prince. But then chapter 8 has 2 more murderous leaders who kill multiple people without any regret, without any remorse. And Machiavelli himself is very nonchalant about these murders, right? So we'll have to understand why. Machiavelli was born in 1469 in Florence, from a Florentine family of the minor aristocracy, meaning that they had ancestors who had the title of nobleman, but it was just the tradition and the reputation that they had, not the wealth or the influence. His father was a lawyer, an attorney, didn't practice much apparently, didn't have to, because the family had houses in Florence, land, rural estates outside of Florence. If you go to Florence, you can still find one of the houses where Machiavelli lived across the Arno. It's hard to see because, you know, Florence nowadays, it's one tourist shop after the other, and there is this corridor, narrow corridor, and if you take it, you'll see a portion of one of the houses of Machiavelli. So Machiavelli received a humanist's education, right? He studied Latin, studied history, studied grammar, which at that point was rhetoric. And we don't know much about his youth, but we know that around 1494, he began working for the government in Florence, when Florence underwent a dramatic change. The famous Medici family members were sent out of Florence into exile because they lost their power over the city, that power they had for the past 60 years, even though they didn't occupy positions in the government usually. In most instances, they governed through friends in positions of power. So the Medici are thrown out of the city, and this young man of about 25 is hired, and in this new government that calls itself the Republic of Florence. It's not really a democracy, it's an elite democracy, right? A democracy where only the rich and powerful can exercise their decisional power. It's about maybe 2 to 3% of the population that is involved in political decisions, and those are the merchants, the shopkeepers of a certain level, the professionals of a certain level, right? The top 2 to 3%. We know that in 1498, Machiavelli becomes the secretary of the second chancery that deals with foreign affairs and diplomatic missions, the collection of information from spies, informants, diplomats. And This title, secretary, is often associated with his name. Of course, secretary in the same sense that you find in the title Secretary of State, right? He's not doing clerical work. He's actually setting the agenda for a committee that deals with foreign affairs. So he's not like a minister. He doesn't have power over the foreign politics of Florence, but within that area, he has a lot of indirect power. Sometimes he goes to missions that are delicate, goes himself. For example, the most famous is the one to the court of Cesare Borgia, who was one of the sons of Pope Alexander VI, whom you find in chapter 7 of The Prince. And Cesare Borgia, in around 1502, between 1502 and 1503, was waging war to the city-states of Romagna, so across the Apennines and to the east of Florence. And therefore, his armies are about 2 to 3 days from the city of Florence itself. So Machiavelli is sent there to understand whether Cesare Borgia is preparing to attack Florence, because they would need to get ready to reinforce their army, to call the reserve, to hire more mercenaries. So Machiavelli stays several months there and sends back reports to Florence, which we have survived and are beautiful, because Machiavelli himself says, I cannot understand. I cannot understand this man. I cannot find any information. I cannot buy any information from his collaborators. And therefore, I'm confounded. I'm disappointed in myself as well, as you must be disappointed in me, because I cannot respond to your question. I cannot complete this mission and say for sure whether Cesare Borgia has any aggressive plans towards Florence. In 1512, after many years spent working for the Republic of Florence, Machiavelli loses his job, because the Medicis come back thanks to their allies, recover the power in the city of Florence, and of course, as you would see even with a change of presidency, perhaps, the people who worked for the previous government are fired, especially those in a position of power, and also because the Medicis cannot really trust somebody like Machiavelli, who not only occupied a crucial position in the government of the so-called Republic, but apparently was also a counselor, a personal counselor to the chancellor of that government. So he was advising the head of the previous government. So how can you trust somebody who was so enmeshed, so involved with the previous government? First, he loses a job. And then a few months later, he is arrested and goes through the worst period in his life. There is a conspiracy going on in Florence to overthrow the Medicis again. And a lot of the people involved directly in the conspiracies are Machiavelli's friends. We don't know for sure whether Machiavelli was involved, and probably he was not. But the suspicions were legitimate, and they treated him the same way they would treat any other prisoner, especially a political prisoner. They torture him when they interrogate him to extract the truth about his role in this conspiracy, about other accomplices. The torture they apply to him is called la corda, the rope, whereby they tie rope to your wrists, and then this rope is sent through a ring on top of the ceiling. Then they, of course, lift you in a very awkward position, but the worst part is the ceiling is kind of tall. When they drop you to the floor all of a sudden, and then the cord is stopped, is blocked before you hit the floor, which often results in dislocations and a lot of pain. Multiple times he's subjected to this torture, during the time that is in a cell near Piazza della Signoria in Florence, downtown Florence, he can hear the people being dragged to their execution, the people screaming, and he doesn't know whether he'll be next, right? Finally, they decide that they kill a lot of those suspected to be part of this plot, and they decide to send the others away, but not into exile. Machiavelli sent into confinement into his rural estate in Sant'Andrea in Percussina, where you can still find his country villa. So he is banned from the city, because this way he will not be able to influence the political activities. So we know that from 1513 to 1519 or 20, Machiavelli lives in the countryside. Perhaps he's able to sneak into the city a few times, see his friends, but not frequently, too dangerous. And during his time, he has to manage his estate to make money, to survive, because of course he had the salary that he lost. And he's writing. The first thing he does is to write The Prince, then, and probably writes most of it in a year or two, then goes back to review it, revise it. Then he writes a much longer work called The Discourses, which is about the Republic of Rome and the virtues of the ancient Romans and their political system. In around 1519 to 1520, Machiavelli is able to reconnect with the Medicis. They give him an official role as historian, and he writes the histories of Florence, where he's not talking, well, he has some implicit blames on the Medicis, but for the most part, he writes a positive narrative of the history of Florence during a period when the Medicis controlled the city, which used to be a city-state and became then a signoria. In the 1520s, the Medicis sent him out to diplomatic missions, but it's almost a joke. The diplomatic missions assigned to him are not to other leaders, monarchs, or the Pope, important political figures. No, they send him to a convent who has a legal squabble with the Medicis about a property. They give him the most menial, insignificant missions. And he takes that in strides. He apparently had a lot of irony, and self-irony as well was one of his qualities. In 1527, when he died, in the spring of 1527, the Medicis are thrown out again from the city for a short period of time, and Machiavelli is all excited, thinking that now his time will come. At this point, the people who threw the Medicis out of the city see Machiavelli with suspicion, look at him with suspicion, because he was warming up to the Medicis too much. In May, he falls sick. He's sick for about a month and he dies, apparently a bitter man. The Medici refused to print the Prince. He had dedicated the Prince to one of them, tried, in fact, several, changed the dedication, but they refused to pay for the printing of this book. And the book will be printed only after his death and will make him famous. I wrote careers in here because he was also a successful literary author, especially a playwright. He wrote comedies, plays that filled the theaters in Florence as well as in other places. We have chronicles documenting how successful his plays would be in Venice, with people filling theaters for multiple consecutive nights to see his comedies. Of course, at this point there is no copyright law, so he was not making really any money, especially when the plays were performed outside of Florence. His mindset was first and foremost practical. He was a pragmatic man. So when I told you he was working for the Republic, the enemies of the Medicis, then tried to worm his way up to the Medicis again, work for them. It's not betrayal, it's not double dealing, double crossing. It's just that he wanted to have an impact in politics. He thought he was a good professional, a good administrator, high-ranking administrators, potentially a great advisor to leaders who had to strategize. And in order to do that, he would have done anything in order to be involved in politics, right? In order to be active. And pragmatism is very much in the culture of humanism. The culture of humanism is very much about finding solutions to problems here and now, meaning finding imperfect solutions. Because you don't necessarily have all the time and the resources to find the perfect solution to a problem, but there are plenty of times when you need to provide a solution. Therefore, you emphasize action over thinking, right? Thinking too much and not doing enough, okay? This gives you a sense already of the mindset of somebody who worked on the Prince. The Prince is not about the perfect leader. The perfect leader is not a cruel tyrant who deceives everybody around him and manipulates his subjects. That's the most practical solution to the problems that affected Florence and Italy during that time. And that's why he insisted a lot on this. Nothing less, nothing more devious or diabolic about this. It's interesting how when we find the first reference to the Prince, to Machiavelli writing this book, which is in a letter to his dear friend Francesco Vettori from December 1513, so months after his, a year after the end of his political career, he uses this metaphor. It's a curious letter altogether. The first part of the letter is Machiavelli who goes hunting for little birds, who argues with timberjacks, woodcutters about the price of their services, and Machiavelli who plays cards at the village nearby with the butcher and other people, and they're screaming so loud that everyone from the street can hear them. And then the second part of the letter is about the evening, because Machiavelli is describing the typical job: morning hunting, mid-morning and early afternoon the business, afternoon the game of cards, and then the evening. The evening is studying and writing. And he has this beautiful metaphor that's, where in this passage where he says, and you'll find it as one of the readings, not very long, where he says, when evening comes, I change, right? Because he's been out all day, so his regular clothes are full of mud and dirt. So he says, I change because at night I enter the courts of the ancient men and I ask them questions and they respond to me. But it's a metaphor. It's a metaphor for reading the classics, right? Where you find interesting intellectual elements for this framework. To change means to prepare for the reading. And to ask questions and receive answers, it means that when you read the classics, which is a relevant part of the culture of the Renaissance, you read them with questions, with issues, with solutions that you're looking for. And then you find models that you can extrapolate from classical historians and revise and apply to the present time. And that's the essence of the Renaissance. What's the meaning of Renaissance? Chris? Rebirth, yeah. Right? In Italian is rinascita. And birth, second birth of what? Second birth of the culture of the classics. But it's not a passive retrieval of values and ideas from classical culture. Rather, it's an informed exploration with practical issues, practical problems to address, with solutions taken from the past and revised and reworked to apply to the present. The prince itself, altogether, can be seen as a solution to one problem in Machiavelli's life. And the problem was, how can I resume my political career? I'll write this book, I'll dedicate it to the Medicis. They'll be incensed, they'll be ecstatic about being associated with this great book, and they will see what a shrewd advisor, what a shrewd political operator I can be, so they'll want me as counselor, right? And it never happened. Really, it was a failure. But keep in mind when you read The Prince that it's not just a philosophical treatise about politics. It's many different things. It's the solution to the political and military crisis of Italy. It's the solution to a professional crisis in the life of Machiavelli. And it reflects a mindset where instead of looking for ideal, perfect models and perfect solutions, you understand that some solutions can be raw, can be dirty, but you only have so much time to apply those solutions. Machiavelli often referred to the medical field and to the procedure of a doctor. You need the diagnosis at the right time so that you can administer medications. If a diagnosis is too late, even the proper medication will not restore the health of the patient. So the prince is not the recipe for every time in history. It's primarily the recipe for that situation where Machiavelli understood that Italy, and Florence in particular, was undergoing a crisis and the solution had to be applied quickly. So, of course, he emphasized shortcuts. Political murder is a shortcut, not the key to every political problem. Okay? Keep these things in mind first and foremost. What was going on? Italy, when Machiavelli was born in 1469, was extremely fragmented politically. The north and central portion of Italy especially had a lot of surviving medieval city-states, very small towns with perhaps 20, 30,000 people living within the walls, and the surrounding countryside, and they constituted a separate state. Of course, the smaller states were under the influence of the bigger states. So Venice, or the Duchy of Milan, or the state of the Pope could have the overseeing authority over some of these fragmented areas where you could find a dozen city-states within an area that would be Western Suffolk. Okay? Imagine that. Imagine going from the North Shore to the South Shore and having to cross borders 5, 6, 8 times. With states with different laws, different currencies, different measures, different standards. And some of this fragmentation lasted until 1870, right? When Italy was unified. But Italy was fragmented, extremely fragmented. Even Florence only controlled a portion of Tuscany. And there were other independent states, Lucca, Pisa to the west, Siena to the south. But within Europe, while Italy was so fragmented, within Europe, the nation states had been born and perfected. Talking about especially the French monarchy, the Spanish monarchy, but even the Kingdom of England, the empire, which overlapped with Germany, Austria, part of Switzerland, part of Eastern Europe. So you have these powerful states outside of Italy. You have a lot of fragmentation within Italy, but you also have something else within Italy. You have a lot of money, wealth. You have cash, you have works of art, you have relics. Even those were precious. And Italy occupied a strategic position in the Mediterranean. If you control the Italian seashores, the seaports, then you control the traffic from one side of the Mediterranean to the other, from Africa into Europe. And the wealth of places such as Florence came mostly from importing and exporting. With Florentine merchants going especially to the Middle East to purchase goods, some of which may have come from China or from Indonesia, chemicals as well as gems, silk, raw materials of different kinds. And the second most important activity in Florence was banking. The merchants who made money with import and export, importing raw materials from the Middle East and Asia, manufacturing stuff and exporting what they manufactured into Europe, those merchants would then use the money they made to give out loans to other merchants, right? It was merchant banking, right? Loans of a certain level. Or even, for example, in the 14th century, Florence, a group of bankers in Florence gave 1 million florins, 1 million gold coins to the King of England for a military campaign he was preparing to wage against France, right? So Florence was one of the wealthiest city-states in Italy, one of the wealthiest states in Europe. And this was true of other places. Venice was also very wealthy and very powerful, Milan, etc. So Italy became a target. First, the King of France invaded Italy in 1494 when Machiavelli was starting his political administrative career. And then the situation degenerated in a series of wars that went on for more than 60 years, involving the various Italian states, especially those in the center and the north, as well as France, Spain, and the Empire. At the end of these wars, these three international players gained direct control or indirect influence over portions of Italy. And this slowed down the process of unification. So keep in mind, when you go to Florence and you find all these churches, all these museums, it's not simply because the Florentines had such good taste. It's because they had more money to pay for the best artists, architects, to come and make those works of art, or they collected art themselves, right? You go to Pitti, for example, you go to the Uffizi, and you find some of the works of art you find there are the private collections, part of the private collections of the Florentine families. Okay, so Machiavelli lived through the ascending phase of the crisis, where the crisis was worsening in Italy, and he was eager to find a solution. That's why he emphasized leaders that were new to their position of leadership and leaders who were willing to take shortcuts, including betrayal, including political murder. Okay? Of course, Signoria means in this context that a single family gets in a position of power within a state, and they then become the signori. They produce the leaders of that place, right? Okay, how are we doing so far? Too little, too much? Questions, curiosities? Again, keep in mind it's a period with a lot of crisis at different levels. And I didn't mention the economy, but of course you will be able to imagine that after 1492, the discovery of America, the official discovery of America, not that wasn't there, and the introduction of new routes for commerce into Asia, with the Portuguese, for example, going around Africa to reach India and the Far East, a lot of the raw materials that the Italian merchants used to buy in Egypt or in Palestine would not get there because other European merchants would buy them cheaper at the source. So Italy is about to undergo an economic crisis as well, right? Because all this business is going to be in competition with materials coming from South America, Central America in a short while, and there are people who are able to get the same goods from Asia at a cheaper price, and the merchants don't lose of some of their business. Okay? Now, before we go back to reading from the prints, what are some of the key concepts? The first one is just an expansion of what I just told you. The culture of a humanist like Machiavelli, the culture of the Renaissance, emphasizes a contextual or pragmatic model of the truth rather than a universal model. Meaning, in order to exist, you have to find what is true or what works here and now when you need to know what to do. And it doesn't mean that your solution is perfect or perfectly valid, but a pragmatic approach and action are emphasized over thinking, philosophizing the ideal solution. Just to give you a couple of examples of what a truth applied to a context means. Let's take two short literary episodes. In the Divine Comedy, in the Inferno, the protagonist Dante finds two lovers who are in hell because they had an affair and she was married. They were killed by the husband, and they of course, they had committed a sin, they couldn't confess, they're in hell. Dante asks them how this happened, this terrible sin, this mortal sin, that condemned them to hell. And Francesca, the woman, tells their story, and it's a powerful romantic story, right? Through the story, you feel for these two lovers, right? You feel that they couldn't do otherwise because they were taken by this romantic passion that overpowered them. And there are other things you can find in the footnotes. Of course, these were aristocrats. Therefore, Francesca was married to Paolo's brother, who was the older brother and had to be married to the older brother. It was a political marriage. It was arranged by proxy, so the two didn't even know each other before they married and lived together. So you can find plenty of excuses and you can empathize with the lovers. However, at the end of this episode, before Dante goes on to other areas of hell, a solution, a resolution to the conflict of are they guilty, do they deserve to be in hell, is provided. It doesn't matter that they felt this powerful emotional draw to each other. They committed a sin, pure and simple. It doesn't matter what the circumstances were. If he, Paolo, was the handsome brother, where the older brother was ugly and, in fact, apparently had a disability, he was limping. It doesn't really matter because you cannot change the truth and the validity of God's rules, right? So you can feel differently about them after you hear their story, but in the end there is only one truth. And it doesn't matter what you feel or how much you feel for them, they deserve to be in hell, they'll be in hell for eternity, there is no forgiveness for them. 50 years later, 50 years after the Divine Comedy, there is a collection of short stories written in Florence at the time of the Black Plague, where in a city like Florence, between 40 and 60% of the residents died because of the bubonic plague. And this went on for about a year and a half. So in this, the very first story in this collection, you read about a man called Ciappelletto, who was a terrible man, a notary, but somebody who would forge documents, give false witness, lie, participate in beatings, also a sinner on the moral level in multiple areas of his life. And this man is sent to an area of France to recover a debt from the Burgundians, from the French people of Burgundy. While he is there, he falls sick. He is being housed by 2 Italian merchants. And these Italian merchants know more or less who Ciappelletto is, what a terrible individual Ciappelletto is. And so they don't know what to do, because they say, if we call a priest, he will confess before dying, and the priest, the local French priest, will know what kind of animals these Italians are. So our business will be ruined, our reputation by association will be ruined. If we don't call the priest and let him die without a confession, the people will say, what kind of people are these Italians? They couldn't call a priest for this dying man who will not be saved because he hasn't received forgiveness. This seems to be the dilemma. Ciappelletto, who is in bed, hears these 2 brothers talking outside of the bedroom, calls them in and says, don't worry, call the best, the wisest priest there is, I'll take care of things. The priest comes in, and Ciappelletto proceeds to say that he was a terrible sinner. But he does that so in such a manipulative way that at the end of the confession, the priest will proclaim, after he dies, he proclaims that he's a saint. He will have a homily in the church telling this guy who just died is the purest soul, and the people rush to his body to get a piece of his tunic, some fabric, because they want to have this relic. He does that by saying, oh my God, I did terrible things. My father, I've sinned. For example, I cursed at my mother. And the priest will say, yeah, well, it's a bad thing, but it's not that bad. And Ciappelletto will say, what? What are you saying? My mother, who carried me 9 months in her womb, etc. So he'll call activities that are mild, he'll call them very sinful and repent about them to the point where the priest will believe that he is really almost a saint. He will say things such as, I did this terrible thing, I spit in the church. And the priest will say, well, people do that because churches, well, social places. Oh, no, that's the temple of the Lord. You cannot desecrate it with such an activity. Or he will say, I did my fasting, but then I broke my fasting with some water, and I enjoyed the water too much. And again, the priest will say, it's not such a grave sin. And Ciappelletto will say, no, it is, because we fast for the Lord, so this is disrespecting the Lord. Anyway, so Ciappelletto dies. And the issue, so in the first story, we have 2 lovers sent to hell. In the second story, the issue raised by the narrator is did Ciappelletto go to hell? Because he was a terrible person, he didn't confess. In fact, he had this prank of a confession. And the answer in the view of humanism is a duality of responses. From the point of view of religion, yes, Ciappelletto will go to hell, right? There is no denying that. However, it is also true, remember that for Paolo and Francesca there was no also true, but in the case of Ciappelletto, it is also true that by rendering this false confession in such a masterful, manipulative way, he saved the day for the business of these 2 merchants. So for them, he's the hero. And this kind of separation is the beginning of modern culture, right? You yourself can go and see a movie and find feel empathy or a connection with a character who is evil. You know the character is evil, but you know that the character can be charming or brilliant or powerful in other ways, right? It all depends on the context. So if you take the larger context of morality, ethics, religion, Ciappelletto is a bad man, a sinner, no denying. In the smaller context where he operated at the end of his life, he achieved the outcome he set for himself. In a perfectly Machiavellian way, he was a successful leader. He controlled the situation. He controlled the priest through this manipulative form of eloquence. Okay? And that's what Machiavelli is about. So even when you read Machiavelli and you find him praising Cesare Borgia or other tyrants who killed their opponents, Machiavelli is not saying these people are moral, this is the new morality. No, he's saying in the context of the political game, they could be considered good examples because they achieve their outcomes, even using murder. Within a larger context, you may think they'll go to hell, you may think they were terrible, you may condemn their immorality or their dishonest, illegal actions and behaviors. Okay? So keep in mind this duality when you read Machiavelli. The truth you find in the Prince is not universal, it's about a context. And a strategy is never positive or negative. Machiavelli will never tell you political murder is good. No, political murder can be good in one context, terrible in another context. Right? Because everything is limited, is tied to a context. Okay, so about nature and natural skills. Machiavelli, as a Renaissance intellectual, believed that only some individuals are born with extraordinary natural skills. He strongly believes that we're not all created equal. We're not blank slates. He believes that some people are born to become leader and most people are born to become sheep, to become the political mass in society. They're not irrelevant because there is no power without the members of the political mass working for the state, working for the growth of the economy. But keep this in mind, only some individuals are endowed with natural skills that will allow them to become leaders if they develop those skills, work on them, if they see the opportunities to apply those skills, and if those skills are in demand in the social ecosystem where they were born and they grew, right? Remember chapter 6, the famous phrase, it was necessary for the Jews to be enslaved in Egypt for Moses to become their leader. Meaning Moses was the right leader for that context. In another context, his skills would not have been in demand. Fortune is the other side of your natural skills. Fortune is not luck. Fortune is all the circumstances outside of your control. So even the most skilled leader might have circumstances that do not allow him to be successful. Perfect example of this would be Cesare Borgia. Cesare Borgia, son of a pope who can benefit from the wealth of his father, the political connections of his father, the international allies who are close to his father. However, in the middle of a successful military and political career, his father dies suddenly. Some say he was poisoned, he might have contracted malaria. We don't know for sure. We know that from the chronicles that the body of the Pope, when it was exposed to the public coming to pay respect, looked horrible. And I'll spare the details, of course. But at the same time, around the same time when his father died, Cesare Borgia himself was sick. right? That would be the perfect example of fortune. It doesn't matter how skilled you are if you're sick, as he was in Rome when his armies, the bulk of his armies, the armies of Cesare Borgia, were 250 miles away. Okay? So, there are circumstances beyond your control which you can define as fortune. Whereas natural skills in Machiavelli's lingo are defined as virtue. So whenever you read virtue, those are the natural skills developed by a leader, right? And I said about the leadership and the mass, only few people can become leaders, the others are followers. Okay, so chapter 7, we find Cesare Borgia being proposed as the model, the ideal prince, but not a perfect model, because the chapter starts by suggesting he was as good a prince as you can find, but the chapter ends with his political failure, right? So you know that we're talking about a different kind of truth, a more practical approach to defining a political model, because it's not a perfect model. Cesare Borgia was the son of Pope Alexander VI, a Spanish pope, very powerful, great leader of the church itself, a great spiritual leader, believe it or not, great political leader. He had a long affair with a married woman from Rome, and she carried several sons and daughters for him. Officially, they would be introduced to the court as nieces and nephews of the Pope, but everybody knew they were his sons and daughters that he had with this woman. Cesare Borgia initially was destined by his father to become a cardinal, to enjoy an ecclesiastic career, but he didn't like it. And one of his brothers was supposed to be the military leader, a great military leader. This brother died. Cesare might have had something about it, to do with it. For sure, in the documents of the period, he's described as a monster, a violent man, violent with his enemies, with his competitors, violent with women. All sorts of negative rumors were spread during that time. Some texts depict him as the Antichrist, right? There is a history of the world from Adam and Eve to Cesare Borgia, where there's this long text of about almost 1,000 pages ends with Cesare Borgia in the middle of the worst atrocities, meaning this is the end of the book because we know this is the beginning of the end of the world. What were their goals and strategies? The Pope wanted to consolidate the power of the church, make the church more powerful in an area south of Venice on the Adriatic Sea, where a lot of city-states existed, which were independent and under the influence of the church. Cesare Borgia wanted to create a state there, become the leader of that region, perhaps then attack Florence, become the leader of Tuscany, perhaps become the king of Italy at some point. We see them planning everything in Machiavelli's report account of the facts. That is to say, everything they do in Machiavelli's account is the result of careful planning, not the result of any violent, murderous instinct. They do use violence. For example, at some point, Cesare Borgia calls a group of leaders, military leaders, who were helping him conquer parts of Italy, but they were also competing with him. He couldn't trust them completely. And in fact, we know they were thinking of eliminating Cesare. He calls them December 31st into a town in northern Italy. As soon as they're in with minimal escort, they close the gates, they chase them inside the palace, in the streets, they kill all of them, hang them or stab them. And Machiavelli will just say that those people were simpletons, that were stupid, basically. So how can Machiavelli say that the victims of this horrible murder were simple? Because he's talking about politics. He's not saying that murder is not immoral or a sin. He's saying within that context, it worked in Cesare Borgia's favor, and therefore those were stupid players in that game. Then, as I said, Cesare suffered this misfortune of his father dying, he being sick. At the same time, eventually, he lost his power, was arrested, jailed, then sent out of Italy to Spain, where he will die a few years later. A very interesting example in this chapter is about Romagna, this area of northern Italy, south of Venice. After the conquest by Cesare Borgia, in order to ensure the loyalty of the people living there, Cesare sends a cruel governor called Remiro. Remiro will arrest some of the people, some of the political opponents, will torture some of them, will take some of their properties, will scare them into submission, right? This is the use of force to restore order. Then what is that Cesare Borgia does? Even though Remiro was one of his closest collaborators, he has Remiro taken in front of a court, of a judge, proclaimed guilty of cruelty towards the subjects, and executed in a very cruel and visible fashion, because one day the citizens of Cesena find his body in a piazza cut in two, with the instruments they've used next to it. And Machiavelli says this is a masterful plan, because he exploited the cruelty of this lieutenant to scare the people into submission, but he couldn't continue with this plan. This plan would have caused a rebellion, right? Eventually. So he eliminates Remiro in such a dramatic public way, because this way people will think Cesare Borgia never knew that this lieutenant was so cruel, and when he did learn of his cruelties, he intervened, punished him, so he is a good fatherly leader to our territories. Okay? So he turned force into influence by staging this public trial and execution. Okay? So he switched successfully from force to influence. From direct force, jail, torture, execution, to the use of manipulation, letting the people, his subjects, think that he's a paternal leader. And the next chapter is about the next chapter is like, offers two models that are supersized versions of Cesare Borgia when it comes to murder. The first one is a Greek tyrant from Sicily, Agathocles, when Sicily was a Greek colony, and 4th century BCE. Agathocles has a successful military career and political career in the city of Syracuse, and then at some point, in order to take control of this city and the surrounding state, at some point he'll control most of Sicily, he has a number of people killed, maybe hundreds, maybe thousands of people. Once again, Machiavelli says nothing about it. There is no need to condemn his actions, because politically, these actions made him a successful leader. These actions, the elimination of the oligarchy in this state, the physical elimination of the oligarchs, made him the new leader, helped him secure his power and advance his political agenda. So Machiavelli will not get into the morality of the actions because that's beside the point. The main point in this kind of context and game being, did he achieve his goal of securing power and then use his position of power to advance the agenda of the state, which became more powerful? Yes. Was he a murderer also? Can you condemn him morally? Yes, if you want to. But that's beside the point. Yes, Chris.
So, I just want to make sure I'm not misunderstanding. Machiavelli doesn't see these actions as being for the greater good, really, in any sense. He's not saying it's cruelty in pursuit of like a less cruel world. He's like taking almost the realpolitik angle, where he's saying it's justified insofar as it's what gets you in the door.
The greater good would be the good of the state.
Right.
And even when it's not clear that society will benefit from these actions, in general, Machiavelli has a more conservative view of society, whereby in a place such as Italy in the 1500s, people need a strong leader to behave, to comply with laws and civic rules. And without this kind of strong leaders, there will be anarchy, in his view. In this context, because when Machiavelli talks about the Romans, he sees the Romans as more evolved socially, intellectually, as more mature members of a society, and therefore they could keep the Republic going for a longer period of time. But about his contemporaries, Machiavelli says the most awful things, that they'll be willing to betray each other, do the worst things, still lie, and they need this kind of powerful leader to scare them or manipulate them into compliance with rules that are good for society.
Thank you.
So that would be as close as we get to the greater good. But it's not in terms of moral values.
Right.
What is that society needs in that context, or what is that government needs, or what is that the leader needs to achieve certain goals? Based on that, you can say he played a successful game, and that excuses him in that context. However, you can still judge these leaders morally as sinners, as violators of natural laws, political laws, etc. However, your judgment in Machiavelli's view is irrelevant, right? As a politician playing the game of politics, you just have to consider, what did you want to achieve? What are the means you used? Were you able to achieve the outcome you set for yourself? And was that game compatible with your natural skills and the skills you developed? Now, what's interesting about the skills is that right before telling you, at the very end of chapter 7, right before telling you, the reader, about the failure of Cesare Borgia's career, Machiavelli will mention, I talked to him in Rome. And he told me that he would never had imagined that when his father died, he would have been sick himself. Why does Machiavelli insert himself in the story? Right before telling the conclusion and the failure of Cesare's career. Probably because he wants to suggest that somebody in his position would have benefited from having an advisor like Machiavelli. Because where your own natural skills as leader come short, you need somebody to guide you. Because otherwise, you will just continue to do what you've done in the past, right? The idea that you have natural skills, those might make you successful for a while, but at some point, those skills will not be current anymore. You need someone to fill the gaps around you, to say, look, don't do what you did 10 years ago. At this point, you need to play a different kind of game, right? And we can think of any number of political leaders or social leaders in society right now that would need guidance, right? If you want to volunteer some examples, I'll be glad to hear them, right? So people who continue to play the same game in a different context, expecting the same results, without someone next to them saying, no, this is how you play the game now, as opposed to 10 years ago, etc. Okay? Oliverotto is another fascinating example. Young guy, young leader of mercenaries, who in his 20s fought with Cesare Borgia. He himself was killed, was one of those killed by Cesare Borgia when he went to this place hoping to find an agreement, to negotiate an agreement with Cesare, and instead it was a trap. But what he had done, and what Machiavelli spends a lot of time talking to you about, is that Oliverotto was raised by an uncle, who was the leader in the city in northeastern Italy. And at one point in his life, he wrote to the uncle saying, I want to come back to the town, right? He was campaigning with his mercenaries. And the uncle, of course, says, yes, come back. And he organized a banquet for him. They sit down with the elites, the people, the important people of the town. And Oliverotto tells his uncle, I have something to tell you. Let's move to another room, and proceeds to kill his uncle and take control of the city. So once again, he uses political murder as a shortcut to the conquest of power, power that will be short-lived, because a couple of years later he himself will be killed and will be labeled a simpleton by Machiavelli because he didn't see the trap, right? But in this situation, the simpleton is his uncle, who treats him as family. Now, go back to A Bronx Tale. Remember when Sonny has to tell Calogero, I cannot trust anyone. In my life, no one can be trusted. So even if Sonny cares for Calogero, he will confront him when he suspects that Calogero has planted a bomb or allowed somebody to plant a bomb in Sonny's car, right? And he says, I cannot trust anyone. And this is very Machiavellian. Machiavellian would say, the uncle of Oliverotto should not have trusted his nephew completely, just because they were part of the family, right? Because in this game, trust has no place. You always have to be careful.